The great hall of Blackthorn Pack had never felt so cold. Elena stood in the center of the stone floor, her hands clasped in front of her, while more than 200 pack members watched from the shadows of the towering pillars. Torches burned along the walls, throwing orange light across faces that once smiled at her and now looked away. At the front of the hall, on a raised platform of dark wood, sat Alpha King Draven. His broad shoulders were pulled back, his jaw locked tight, and his eyes, usually warm when they found hers, were fixed somewhere above her head, as if looking at her directly had become too difficult. Beside him stood the pack healer, an older woman named Margaret, holding a small wooden box. Everyone in the hall already knew what was inside it. They did not need to see the results to know why this gathering had been called. "Speak," Draven said. His voice echoed off the stone, flat and commanding, the voice of a king and not of a husband. Margaret opened the box and lifted a folded parchment. Her hands trembled slightly as she read from it, though her voice stayed steady. "After 3 seasons of testing and confirmation through the old moon ritual, I regret to report that Luna Elena carries no trace of the fertility mark. The bond has been examined by 3 healers from 3 packs. The result is unanimous." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elena kept her chin lifted, refusing to let her shoulders drop, though inside her chest something was breaking apart piece by piece. She had known this moment was coming for weeks. She had watched Draven grow more distant, watched the advisors whisper behind closed doors, watched the weight of expectation settle over the pack like a storm cloud that would not pass. Blackthorn Pack was not just any pack. It was the oldest and strongest bloodline among the Northern Territories, and for 300 years, an unbroken line of alphas had ruled from father to son. Draven was the last of his line. There were no brothers, no cousins close enough in blood to inherit the crown. Everything depended on an heir, and if Elena could not give him one, the entire foundation of Blackthorn's power would begin to crack. She understood the politics. She understood the pressure. But understanding did not make it hurt less. When Draven finally rose from his seat and looked directly at her for the first time since the gathering began. "Elena," he said, and for a moment, just a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or grief. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, buried beneath the mask of a king who could not afford to be seen as weak. "The council has spoken. A Luna who cannot carry an heir cannot remain bonded to the throne. By the old law, I release you from our bond, and you are to leave Blackthorn territory before the next full moon." The words landed like physical blows. Elena felt her knees threaten to buckle, but she forced herself to stand straight, to breathe, to hold on to whatever dignity she had left. "Draven," she whispered, so quietly that only the closest members of the pack could hear it. "We swore to each other. You said nothing would break this bond." His jaw tightened. For a heartbeat, he looked like he might step down from the platform, might cross the space between them, and take her hands the way he used to. But then Charles, his oldest advisor, leaned toward him and murmured something in his ear, something about legacy, about duty, about the pack's survival depending on strength and continuity. Draven's expression hardened again. "The law is the law," he said. "This is not something either of us can change." Elena looked around the hall one last time. She saw faces she had known for years, some sympathetic, some cold, some simply relieved that the uncertainty was finally over. She saw the empty space beside the healer, where children of other Lunas usually stood, proof of a woman's worth, measured only by what she could produce for the pack. She saw Draven's hands, clenched into fists at his sides, as if he were fighting something inside himself that he refused to name. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the hall. Her footsteps were the only sound in the enormous silence, echoing against stone that had witnessed 3 centuries of history, none of it kind to women like her. Outside, the night air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. Elena did not stop walking until she reached the edge of the packlands, where a single guard waited to escort her beyond the border markers. He did not speak to her. He simply walked a few paces behind, making sure she crossed the invisible line that separated Blackthorn territory from the rest of the world. When she finally stopped, deep in the dark forest beyond the border, she allowed herself to break. She sank to her knees in the frost-covered grass and let the sobs come, deep and shaking, the kind of crying that came from somewhere far beneath the surface. 5 years of marriage, 5 years of loving a man who had just cast her aside in front of everyone who mattered to her. 5 years of trying every remedy, every ritual, every desperate hope that the healers might be wrong. And now it was over. Not because she had done anything wrong, not because their bond had weakened, but because her body had failed to do the one thing a pack believed a woman was meant to do. She stayed there for a long time, long enough for the cold to seep into her bones, long enough for the moon to shift position in the sky. When she finally rose, something in her had changed. The grief was still there, raw and enormous, but underneath it, a quiet resolve had begun to take shape. She would not go back and beg. She would not wait outside the border hoping Draven might change his mind. She would walk forward, into whatever life remained for her, and she would find a way to survive it. She did not know, as she took her first steps away from Blackthorn territory, that her body was already carrying a secret far greater than anyone could have imagined. A secret that would one day shake the foundations of Blackthorn Pack far more than her exile ever had. The road south was long and unfamiliar. Elena had grown up within Packlands her entire life, first in her birth pack, and then in Blackthorn after her mating ceremony. She had never traveled the human world alone, had never needed to. Now, with nothing but the clothes she wore and a small bag of coins Margaret had quietly pressed into her hand before she left, she had no choice. She walked for 3 days before reaching the outskirts of a small human town called Ashford. It was nothing like the grand halls and stone towers of Blackthorn. Narrow streets lined with wooden houses, a market square with a stone well at its center, and people who paid her no attention at all, because to them, she was simply another traveler passing through. For the first time in years, nobody knew her name. Nobody knew she had once been a Luna. Nobody looked at her with pity or judgment. She was, for better or worse, invisible. She found a small room above a bakery, paying for a week's stay with what little money she had left. The woman who ran the bakery, a kind widow named Nora, did not ask questions about where Elena had come from, or why she traveled alone. She simply handed her a loaf of bread on her first night, and told her the bakery could use extra hands if she was willing to work. Elena accepted without hesitation. She needed something to occupy her thoughts, something to keep her from replaying that final scene in the Great Hall, over and over in her mind. Kneading dough, tending the ovens, sweeping flour from the floor. These small, repetitive tasks became a kind of medicine, dulling the sharp edges of her grief one day at a time. But even honest work could not fully quiet the ache inside her. At night, alone in her small room, she would press her hand against her chest, feeling for the place where the mate bond used to hum with warmth whenever Draven was near. It was gone now, or so she believed, severed the moment he spoke those words before the council. She told herself she would learn to live without it. She told herself many things during those long, lonely nights, trying to build a version of herself that did not need Blackthorn Pack, did not need Draven, did not need anything from the life she had been forced to leave behind. Weeks passed in this quiet rhythm. Elena worked at the bakery each morning before dawn, helped Nora manage the small shop through the day, and spent her evenings sitting by the window of her room, watching the town settle into darkness. She began, slowly, to feel something like peace. Not happiness, not yet, but the absence of constant pain was its own kind of relief. Then, one morning in early autumn, everything changed. She woke feeling unusually tired, her stomach turning with a nausea she had never experienced before. She assumed it was something she had eaten, perhaps bread that had gone bad, and pushed through her morning tasks, despite the discomfort. But the nausea did not pass. It returned the next morning, and the one after that, growing worse each day, until she could barely stand the smell of the ovens she had once found so comforting. Nora noticed before Elena allowed herself to consider the truth. "You've been pale as a ghost all week," Nora said one afternoon, setting down a tray of fresh bread and studying Elena with the sharp, knowing eyes of a woman who had raised 4 children of her own. "And you've been running to that basin more mornings than not. When was your last monthly cycle?" Elena opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. She tried to remember, tried to count backward through the weeks since she had left Blackthorn, and found that she could not recall the last time. Between the grief and the long journey, and the shock of everything that had happened, she had lost track entirely. "That's not possible," she whispered, more to herself than to Nora. I was told I couldn't." But even as she said the words, A strange, disbelieving hope began to stir, somewhere deep inside her chest. That evening, Elena walked to the small healer's cottage at the edge of town, her heart pounding with every step. The healer there, an elderly man with kind eyes and steady hands, examined her carefully, asking questions about her health and her history. When he finally sat back and looked at her, his expression was gentle but certain. "You are with child," he said simply. "Further along than you might think. I would guess 3 months, perhaps close to 4. Elena stared at him, unable to speak. 3 months. That meant she had already been carrying when she stood before the council, when the healers of Blackthorn examined her and declared her barren, when Draven looked at her with cold finality and sent her away. It should have been impossible. Every healer in Blackthorn, every test, every ritual, had confirmed the same result. And yet here, in this small cottage in a human town far from everything she had known, an old healer, with no connection to wolf magic or pack politics, was telling her the opposite truth. She did not understand it. She would not understand it for years to come, not fully. But in that moment, sitting in the healer's cottage with her hand pressed against her still flat stomach, she understood one thing with absolute clarity. She could never let Draven or Blackthorn Pack know. If Draven learned she was pregnant, one of 2 things would happen, and neither one filled her with anything but fear. Either he would see it as proof of the council's error and demand her return, forcing her back into a world that had cast her out and humiliated her in front of everyone she knew, a world where her child would be raised not as a person, but as a political prize, the answer to a succession crisis, valued only for what its existence could secure. Or worse, the enemies of Blackthorn, the rival packs who had spent years scheming for a chance to weaken the bloodline, might see a fatherless-seeming child as an opportunity, a vulnerability to exploit before the truth could even be confirmed. She thought of the way the advisors had looked at her in that final gathering, calculating and cold. She thought of the whispered politics that had shaped every decision in Draven's court, decisions that had ultimately led to her exile despite 5 years of love and loyalty between them. She could not trust that world to protect an innocent child, not even the child of its own king. The old healer studied her face as these thoughts passed behind her eyes, and something in his expression told her he understood more than she had said aloud. "Whatever trouble follows you," he said quietly, "you don't have to face it here. There's no one in this town who knows your name or your past. If you wish to disappear, truly disappear, I know of no better place to start than a town with no memory of who you were." Elena looked at him for a long moment, and then, slowly, she nodded. That night, she made her decision. She would not return to Blackthorn. She would not send word to Draven. She would not risk her unborn child to a world that had already shown her exactly how little mercy it was capable of. Instead, she would build a new life, a hidden life, far from pack politics and royal bloodlines, where her child, or children, for something told her there might be more than one, could grow up safe and unseen. She began preparing immediately. She thanked Nora for her kindness, but explained she would need to move on, citing a distant relative she needed to find. Nora, though clearly disappointed, did not press for more details, simply wishing her well and pressing a small pouch of coins into her hands, more generosity than Elena felt she deserved. Elena spent her final days in Ashford, saying quiet goodbyes to the small life she had built there, then set off once more, this time with a purpose greater than survival. She was not just protecting herself anymore. She was protecting the impossible gift growing inside her, a gift that no healer, no council, and no king had believed could ever exist. As she walked away from Ashford toward a future she could not yet imagine, she allowed herself, for the first time since that terrible night in the Great Hall, to feel something other than grief. She felt hope, fragile, uncertain, but real. Somewhere far behind her, in the stone halls of Blackthorn Pack, Draven sat alone in his private chambers, staring into a fire that gave no warmth. He did not yet know what he had lost. He did not yet know the truth that Elena carried within her, a truth that would one day return to reshape everything he believed about strength, about legacy, and about the woman he had let walk away. But that reckoning was still years in the future. For now, there was only the long road ahead, and a mother determined to protect the miracle no one believed possible. Elena gasped as another wave of pain rolled through her body, gripping the edge of the wooden bed frame until her knuckles turned white. Outside the small cottage window, rain hammered against the glass, and thunder rolled across the distant hills. She was alone, miles from any town, in a cabin she had rented from a farmer who asked no questions about a woman traveling by herself in her final months of pregnancy. "Breathe," she told herself through gritted teeth, repeating the word the midwife in the last town had taught her weeks ago, before Elena had moved on again, always moving, always staying one step ahead of anyone who might recognize her. Just breathe. She had chosen this remote farmland deliberately, far from any city, far from any pack territory, far from anywhere Draven's people might think to search even if they were searching at all. She doubted they were. As far as Blackthorn Pack knew, their barren former Luna had simply vanished into the human world, an unremarkable footnote in the pack's long history. Another contraction seized her, sharper than the last, and Elena cried out despite herself. She had insisted on delivering without a midwife present, afraid that even a stranger's knowledge of her circumstances might somehow trace back to her, though rationally, she knew the fear had become excessive, almost paranoid. Still, 5 months of running, of changing her name twice, of watching over her shoulder at every crossroads, had worn deep grooves of caution into her mind that she could not easily smooth away. Hours passed in a blur of pain and determination. When the first cry finally broke through the storm outside, Elena wept with an exhaustion so complete it felt like her body might simply dissolve into the mattress beneath her. She looked down at the small, wriggling form in her arms, a boy, with a shock of dark hair and lungs strong enough to compete with the thunder outside. But her relief lasted only a moment before another contraction gripped her, and she realized with a shock of understanding that the labor was not yet finished. 40 minutes later, a second cry joined the first. A girl this time, smaller than her brother but no less fierce in her arrival into the world. Elena lay back against the pillows, cradling both children against her chest, tears streaming freely down her face. Twins. She had suspected as much during the final months, feeling movement in 2 distinct places, but confirmation of it now, holding both of her children in her arms, filled her with an emotion so overwhelming she could not name it. Joy and terror tangled together, love so immediate and fierce it frightened her with its intensity. She named the boy Kai, for the ocean her grandmother used to speak of in old stories, a symbol of strength and constant motion. She named the girl Lyra, for the stars that had guided her through so many nights of walking alone toward an uncertain future. In the days that followed, as Elena recovered her strength and learned the exhausting, beautiful rhythm of caring for 2 newborns at once, she noticed something that confirmed her deepest fears and her wildest hopes all at once. Both children, though only days old, carried faint markings behind their left ears, markings that any wolf shifter would recognize instantly as signs of exceptional bloodline strength. Markings that, in Blackthorn Pack tradition, only appeared on children descended directly from an alpha line, stretching back generations. There was no mistaking it. These were not ordinary pups. These were Draven's children, undeniably, unmistakably, carrying the mark of Blackthorn's royal bloodline in their very skin. Elena stared at those markings for a long time that first week, turning over the impossible question that had haunted her since the healer in Ashford confirmed her pregnancy. How had this happened? Every test, every ritual, every healer in Blackthorn had confirmed her infertility with absolute certainty, and yet here were 2 living, breathing proof that all of it had been wrong. She would never fully understand the answer, though in later years she would hear whispers of old magic, of moon rituals that sometimes misread a bond still too young and untested to reveal its true nature, of ancient bloodlines that occasionally produced fertility so rare it defied even the most careful measurement. For now, all she knew was that the children in her arms were real, were hers, and were in more danger than she could fully comprehend. If Blackthorn Pack ever learned that Draven's exiled mate had given birth to twins carrying the royal mark, everything would change instantly and irreversibly. The council that had cast her aside as unworthy would suddenly see her as essential, not because they valued her, but because her children represented the only viable heirs to the Blackthorn throne. Draven himself, whatever guilt or regret he carried, would almost certainly demand their return, seeing them first as heirs, and only second, if at all, as the son and daughter he had never known he had. And there were darker possibilities too. Rival packs who had spent decades scheming against Blackthorn's dominance would see 2 vulnerable infants as either a threat to be eliminated before they could grow into their power, or a prize to be stolen and used as leverage against the throne. Elena had grown up hearing stories of pack politics, turning vicious over matters of succession, alliances broken, betrayals executed in the name of ambition. She would not risk her children becoming pieces in that dangerous game. She made her decision within that first week, holding both children close, as rain continued to fall against the cottage windows. She would disappear completely, not just from Blackthorn, but from the entire world of shifters and packs and ancient bloodlines. She would build a life so quiet, so ordinary, so far beneath the notice of anyone searching for royal heirs, that Kai and Lyra could grow up safe, unaware of the danger that surrounded the truth of their birth, until they were old enough to understand it, or perhaps never needing to know at all. She changed her name one final time, choosing something simple and unremarkable. Elena became Helen Marsh, a young widow traveling to start a new life with her infant children, after losing her husband to illness. A story simple enough to explain her circumstances without inviting further questions. She traveled far from the northern territories where most shifter packs made their homes, eventually settling in a coastal town called Brindlewood, hundreds of miles south, where the population was large enough to offer anonymity, but modest enough to avoid the kind of political attention that might draw pack scouts or curious eyes. She found work as a seamstress, a skill her own mother had taught her years before her mating to Draven, back when she was simply a girl in her birth pack, with no notion of the life that awaited her. The work was steady, if modest, and it allowed her to work from a small rented room while caring for her children, avoiding the need to leave them with strangers who might notice the unusual strength in Kai's tiny grip, or the way Lyra's eyes seemed to track movement with unsettling precision, even as an infant. As the twins grew from infants into toddlers, Elena watched them carefully, noting every sign of their heritage with a mixture of pride and worry. Kai took his first steps at 7 months, far earlier than any human child, and by his first birthday, he could already climb furniture with an agility that made Elena's heart leap into her throat every time she turned her back. Lyra developed differently but no less remarkably, showing an unusual sensitivity to sound and scent, often turning toward doors or windows moments before a visitor arrived, as if she could sense their approach long before any human child could. Elena worked tirelessly to teach both children, from the earliest age she dared, the importance of restraint. She could not tell them the full truth yet, not when they were too young to understand the weight of secrecy, but she found ways to guide their behavior, without frightening them, turning lessons about blending in into games about being quiet as mice, or gentle as falling leaves. "We have to be careful," she would tell them, even when they were barely old enough to understand full sentences. "Some things about us are special, and special things need to stay quiet until it's the right time to share them." Kai, even as a small child, seemed to grasp the seriousness beneath her gentle words more than Lyra did, perhaps sensing his mother's underlying anxiety, even if he could not name it. He became protective of his sister early, standing close to her in crowds, watching for danger with an instinct far beyond his years. Life in Brindlewood was not easy. Money remained tight, and Elena often worked late into the night finishing sewing commissions after the twins had gone to sleep, exhaustion becoming a familiar companion in those early years. But there was a peace in the difficulty too, a peace born from knowing that whatever hardships she faced, they were hers to bear freely, not imposed upon her by a council that saw her only as a vessel for producing heirs. She thought of Draven often in those quiet late nights, though she tried not to. She wondered if he ever thought of her, if he had found another mate to fill the void she had left behind, if the ache she still felt in the space where their bond used to hum with warmth was something he felt too, or if he had simply moved forward, secure in his belief that he had made the necessary choice for his pack's future. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself the man who had stood on that platform and coldly recited the words of Exile was not someone she needed to think about anymore, that her life now belonged entirely to the 2 small children who depended on her for everything. But some nights, when the twins were finally asleep and the small rented room fell silent except for the distant sound of waves against the Brindlewood shore, she would press her hand against her chest, feeling for that old familiar warmth, and find only a faint echo remaining, a ghost of a bond that refused to fully disappear, no matter how many miles or years separated her from the man who had once been her entire world. She did not know that in the stone halls of Blackthorn, far to the north, Draven felt that same ghost of a bond, faint but persistent, refusing to fade despite every attempt he made to move forward with his life. She did not know that he had tried, 3 times now, to accept a new mate, as his advisors urged, and 3 times the bonding mark on his chest had refused to respond to anyone but her. She did not know, and for now, she did not need to. All that mattered was the small, precious world she had built for her children, hidden away from the storm that had once threatened to destroy them all, before they had even taken their first breath. Years would pass before that storm found them again. But find them, eventually, it would. Lyra's scream cut through the schoolyard like a blade, and every head turned toward the corner of the playground where 3 older boys had cornered a smaller child against the fence. Kai moved before he even understood what he was doing, sprinting across the gravel yard so fast that a teacher watching from the doorway would later swear she had never seen a child run that quickly. He reached the fence just as the tallest of the 3 boys shoved his sister hard enough to knock her to the ground, and something inside Kai, something he had never felt before, snapped loose like a rope pulled too tight. He grabbed the boy's arm, and the boy immediately yelped in pain, stumbling backward as if he had touched something far stronger than an 8-year-old child had any right to be. "Leave her alone," Kai said, and his voice came out low and steady, in a way that startled even him. The 3 boys backed away, more confused than frightened, rubbing at an arm that Kai had barely touched but had somehow left bruised beneath the sleeve. They muttered something about telling their teacher, and hurried off across the yard, throwing wary glances back over their shoulders the entire way. Kai knelt beside Lyra, helping her to her feet, and brushing gravel from her scraped palms. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Lyra said, though her voice wavered slightly, more from the shock of the confrontation than any real injury. "You didn't have to do that. I could have handled it." "I know," Kai said, though they both understood the truth was more complicated. Lyra was quick and clever, but she was also smaller than most children her age, and the boys who had cornered her outweighed her by a considerable margin. From across the schoolyard, a man in a plain gray coat watched the entire scene unfold, with far more interest than an ordinary passerby should have shown. He had arrived in Brindlewood 3 days earlier, sent by a minor pack from the Eastern Territories, to investigate rumors of unusual shifter activity, reported by a traveling trader who had passed through the coastal town weeks before. The man's name was Daniel, and he had spent the better part of 2 decades as a scout and emissary for various packs, developing a keen eye for the subtle signs that separated ordinary humans from shifters hiding among them. What he had just witnessed, a young boy moving with speed and strength far beyond his apparent age, protecting his sister with an instinct that bordered on feral, was exactly the kind of anomaly he had been sent to investigate. He watched as the twins made their way toward a woman waiting at the edge of the schoolyard, a woman with tired eyes and careful posture, the kind of posture Daniel had learned to associate with people who spent considerable energy trying not to draw attention to themselves. She wrapped an arm around each of her children and led them away quickly, glancing around the schoolyard with a wariness that seemed disproportionate to a simple playground scuffle. Daniel followed at a discreet distance, careful to stay far enough back that his presence would not be noticed. He watched the small family walk several blocks to a modest building above a tailor's shop, watched the woman usher her children inside, and glance up and down the street one final time before closing the door behind them. He had seen enough. Whatever the connection, this family was hiding something, and the boy's display of strength was undeniable proof that at least part of what he was hiding involved shifter blood. That evening, in his rented room at a small inn near the harbor, Daniel wrote a detailed report of what he had witnessed, careful to include every detail he could recall about the boy's speed, the bruising left by a grip that should have been far too gentle to cause harm, and the mother's evident anxiety about being observed. He did not yet know whose bloodline the children carried, only that it was significant enough to warrant further investigation. He sent the report by messenger hawk the following morning, addressed to the Eastern Pack that had commissioned his services. He did not know, as he watched the bird disappear into the morning sky, that the information contained within his report would eventually make its way, through a chain of alliances and favors owed, to the one place he had never intended it to reach: Blackthorn Pack. Meanwhile, inside the small apartment above the tailor's shop, Elena sat with her children at their modest dinner table, her heart still racing from the fright of learning about the schoolyard incident when Lyra's teacher had sent word home earlier that afternoon. "You cannot use your strength like that in front of other people," Elena said, keeping her voice as calm and measured as she could manage, despite the fear churning in her stomach. "I know you were protecting your sister, and I understand why you did it, but you have to be more careful." Kai stared down at his plate, guilt evident in the set of his shoulders. "I didn't mean to hurt him. I just wanted him to stop." "I know, sweetheart." Elena reached across the table and took his hand gently. "But other people cannot know what you can do. It isn't safe. Not for you, and not for Lyra." "Why not?" Lyra asked, her voice small but curious in the way it always was when she sensed her mother withholding something important. "Why do we have to hide? Everyone else at school just gets to be themselves." Elena had been dreading this question for years, knowing it would come eventually as her children grew older, and more aware of the ways they differed from the other children around them. She had rehearsed various versions of an explanation in her mind countless times, but faced now, with her daughter's earnest, searching eyes, all of those careful words seemed to abandon her. "Some people are born different," she said slowly, choosing each word with care. "Special, in ways that not everyone understands, and sometimes, when people don't understand something, they become afraid of it, and fear can make people do unkind things. I want to protect you both from that, for as long as I possibly can." "Are you different too?" Kai asked. Elena hesitated, then nodded. "I am. And so was your father." The word hung in the air between them, unfamiliar and heavy. Neither child had ever asked much about their father before, sensing perhaps through some instinct of their own that the topic caused their mother pain. But now, with the question of their own strange nature finally being addressed directly, Lyra's curiosity could not be contained. What was he like? Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them back before either child could notice. "He was strong," she said finally, "strong and important, and he loved his people very much. But things happened between us that made it impossible for us to stay together, and I made the choice to raise you both, far away from where he lives, to keep you safe." "Safe from what?" Kai pressed, his young mind sharp enough to sense there was more beneath his mother's careful explanation. Elena looked at her children for a long moment, weighing how much truth they were ready to bear. Finally she sighed and reached for both their hands. "There are people in the world who would want to use you, or hurt you, if they knew what you could do, and who your father was. I'm not ready to tell you everything yet, but I promise, when you're older, when I'm certain it's safe, I will tell you the whole truth. Until then, I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Both children nodded, though Elena could see the questions still simmering behind their eyes, questions that would only grow more insistent as they aged. She knew this conversation was only the beginning, a crack in the careful wall of secrecy she had built around their lives, and she wondered, not for the first time, how much longer she could hold that wall together, before the truth found a way to break through on its own. That night, after the twins had finally gone to sleep, Elena sat by the small window of their apartment, looking out over the darkened rooftops of Brindlewood, toward the distant harbor. She thought about the man in the gray coat she had noticed watching them from across the schoolyard when she arrived to collect her children, a stranger whose presence had set every instinct in her body on alert. She had learned, over the years of hiding, to trust those instincts absolutely. Something about the way he had watched them, the careful, professional attention of someone gathering information, rather than simply passing time, had frightened her more than she wanted to admit. She resolved, sitting alone in the quiet darkness, that it might finally be time to move again. Brindlewood had been good to them for nearly 6 years, longer than any other place they had stayed, and the thought of uprooting her children once more, away from the small school they loved and the modest life they had built, filled her with exhaustion. But she had not survived this long by ignoring her instincts, and every instinct she possessed was telling her that their careful anonymity had finally begun to crack. She began making plans that very night, sketching out a list of towns further along the coast where she might find work, calculating how much money she had saved, and how far it might stretch to cover the costs of moving and settling somewhere new. She did not sleep at all, her mind working through contingencies late into the early hours of the morning. But even as she planned, a part of her wondered, with a mixture of dread and something she refused to name as hope, whether it was truly still possible to outrun a truth as powerful as the one her children carried within them. The mark behind their ears, the strength in Kai's grip, the sharpness of Lyra's senses, all of it spoke of a bloodline too significant to remain hidden forever. Perhaps, she thought as dawn finally began to lighten the sky outside her window, the years of hiding had only ever been borrowed time. Perhaps the reckoning she had run from for so long was simply waiting for the right moment to arrive, regardless of how far or how often she tried to outpace it. She did not know, as she finally allowed herself a few hours of restless sleep, that Daniel's report was already making its way through a network of pack alliances that would eventually place it directly into the hands of Blackthorn's own scouts. She did not know that within weeks, a name would rise from that report, a name tied to markings behind a child's ear that only one bloodline in the Northern Territories could claim. The wall she had built around her children's lives, brick by careful brick over 6 long years, was about to come tumbling down. Draven's fist came down hard on the council table, splitting the ancient wood down its center with a crack that silenced the entire chamber instantly. "Enough," he said, his voice low and dangerous, in a way that made even his oldest advisors shrink back in their seats. "I said no." Charles, the advisor who had guided him through 6 years of failed attempts to secure the throne's future, spread his hands in a gesture of practiced patience. "My king, the Farrington pack has offered their eldest daughter for a 3rd time. Refusing again will be seen as an insult, and Blackthorn cannot afford to alienate the Southern alliances, not with the Eastern packs growing bolder by the season." "I do not care what it will be seen as," Draven snapped, rising from his chair so abruptly that it scraped loudly against the stone floor. "I told you after the first attempt, and I told you again after the second. The mark will not respond. It has nothing to do with the woman offered. It is not going to change no matter how many daughters you parade before me." The bonding mark in question sat directly over Draven's heart, an intricate pattern that had blazed to life the moment he first touched Elena's hand 6 years ago, back when he was young and certain and utterly convinced that their bond was the strongest thing he would ever know. In the years since her exile, he had tried 3 times, at his advisor's desperate urging, to accept a new mate through the old rituals, hoping the mark might transfer its allegiance and finally allow the pack to move forward with a proper Luna, and, eventually, an heir. Each time, the mark had remained cold and unresponsive, refusing to acknowledge any woman other than the one he had cast out 6 years earlier. He had never told anyone, not even Charles, how much those failed attempts had cost him. Each ritual required him to stand before a new potential mate, to offer his hand and his intention, only to feel nothing at all where he had once felt an overwhelming rush of warmth and connection. Each failure was a fresh wound, a reminder of exactly what he had thrown away in the name of duty and legacy. "My king," Charles said carefully, choosing his words with the caution of a man who had watched his ruler's temper grow shorter with each passing year. "Perhaps the issue is not the mark itself, but something deeper. Perhaps the bond was never truly broken, only suppressed by the exile ritual, and it requires something more than a simple ceremony to fully release its hold." Draven turned toward the window of the council chamber, looking out over the vast forests of Blackthorn territory stretching toward the horizon. 6 years had passed since he stood on that platform and spoke the words that sent Elena away forever. 6 years of ruling a pack that grew increasingly restless over the absence of a clear air. 6 years of nights spent alone in chambers that had once been shared, staring at a fire that never seemed to provide any real warmth. He had told himself, in the early months after her exile, that he had made the only choice available to him. The law was clear, the council's pressure had been relentless, and a pack as powerful as Blackthorn could not afford the perception of weakness that came with a barren Luna, not when rival packs were constantly searching for any crack in their dominance to exploit. But as the years passed, that certainty had slowly eroded, replaced by a growing, gnawing doubt that he rarely allowed himself to fully examine. He had loved Elena, truly loved her, in a way he had never expected to feel for anyone. And in a single afternoon, pressured by advisors and bound by ancient laws he had never questioned, he had thrown that love away as if it meant nothing at all. "Where is she now?" he asked quietly, still facing the window. Charles hesitated. "My king, we have not tracked her movements since her departure. It was not required by the exile terms, and—" "Find out," Draven said, turning back to face his advisor with an intensity that made Charles take an involuntary step backward. I want to know where she is. Not to bring her back, not to interfere in whatever life she has built. I simply want to know she is safe. Charles nodded slowly, though uncertainty flickered across his weathered features. As you wish, my king. I will send scouts to make discreet inquiries. That conversation had taken place nearly 2 years before this particular council meeting, and in all that time, Charles's scouts had found no reliable trace of Elena. She had vanished so thoroughly, so completely, that even experienced trackers accustomed to locating hidden shifters had come up empty-handed time and again. Draven had eventually stopped asking for updates, telling himself it was better this way, that whatever piece she had found, wherever she had found it, was hers to keep without his interference. But tonight, standing in the ruins of another failed political negotiation, all of those old wounds felt freshly opened. Leave me, he said to the assembled council, and though several advisors exchanged uncertain glances, none dared to argue. The chamber emptied slowly, until only Charles remained, lingering near the doorway, with the particular patience of a man who had served this family for decades, and understood when his king needed silence more than counsel. My king, Charles said finally, just before stepping through the doorway himself. There is one matter I had intended to raise, though perhaps this is not the moment. Draven did not turn from the window. Speak. A report arrived 3 days ago, passed along through our alliance with the Eastern Territories. A scout working for a minor pack in the south reported unusual activity in a coastal human town, a child displaying strength and speed inconsistent with human nature. The scout's employer, seeking to strengthen ties with Blackthorn, forwarded the details to us as a courtesy, believing it might be relevant to our interests given the unusual nature of the bloodline markers described. Draven's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. What bloodline markers? Charles produced a folded parchment from within his coat, one he had apparently been carrying for days, uncertain of the right moment to present it. The scout described a mark behind the child's ear, consistent with the ancient pattern unique to direct alpha descendants of our line. My king, I did not wish to raise false hope, and there could certainly be other explanations, distant relations perhaps, or... Draven crossed the chamber in 3 long strides, and snatched the parchment from Charles's hand, his eyes scanning the description with an intensity that made the words blur before him. A boy, approximately 8 years old, unusual strength and speed, a protective instinct toward a twin sister of matching age, living with a woman of careful, guarded demeanor, in a coastal town called Brindlewood. Twins. The word struck him like a physical blow, and for a long moment, he could not breathe properly. When was this child born? He demanded, though he already suspected the answer, the timeline assembling itself in his mind, with terrible, inevitable clarity. The scout's report estimated the twins to be approximately 6 years of age, my king, which would place their birth roughly 6 months after. Charles did not finish the sentence, but he did not need to. 6 months after Elena's exile, which meant, if the timeline held true, that she had already been carrying when she stood before the council and heard herself declared barren. She had already been pregnant when he coldly sent her away, and she had never told him, had never sent word, had simply disappeared and raised his children in secret for 6 long years. The realization hit him with a force that nearly buckled his knees. 6 years. 6 years of a son and daughter he had never known existed, growing up somewhere far away without a father, without the protection and legacy that should have been theirs by birthright, all because he had been too blinded by duty and pride to question a council's judgment that had, apparently, been catastrophically wrong. Why was I not told of this sooner? His voice came out rougher than he intended, edged with a fury that had nothing to do with Charles, and everything to do with the years he had already lost. My king, the report only arrived days ago, and I wished to verify what details I could before. I want a full contingent prepared to travel south immediately, Draven said, already moving toward the chamber door, his mind racing through logistics, even as emotion threatened to overwhelm his careful control. I will go myself. I will not send scouts or intermediaries for something this important. My king, if I may, Charles said, hurrying to keep pace with Draven's long strides through the hallway. Consider the delicacy of the situation. If this woman has spent 6 years hiding these children, she has done so for reasons of her own, likely reasons of protection, given the political dangers such heirs would face if their existence became known too widely. Arriving with a full contingent of pack warriors may not achieve the reception you hope for. Draven stopped abruptly, forcing himself to consider his advisor's words despite the urgency clawing at his chest. Charles was right, of course. If Elena had spent 6 years in careful hiding, protecting their children from exactly the kind of political attention his sudden arrival with an armed escort would represent, then approaching with anything less than complete discretion could shatter whatever fragile trust remained between them before he even had the chance to speak with her. "A small party," he said finally, forcing his voice back into something resembling calm. "Myself, and no more than 2 trusted guards. We travel quietly, and we do not announce our purpose to anyone outside this room until I have spoken with Elena myself." Charles nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "And if she does not wish to be found, my king?" 6 years of hiding suggests a woman determined to keep her children away from Blackthorn entirely, perhaps even from you specifically. The question lodged itself painfully in Draven's chest, because he did not have a ready answer. He had spent 6 years telling himself he had made an unavoidable choice, that the exile was simply the price of leadership and duty. But faced now with the knowledge that Elena had carried and raised his children entirely alone, entirely in secret, entirely because she had likely believed, with good reason, that Blackthorn Pack would see those children as nothing more than political assets rather than family, he could no longer hide from the truth of what his choice had actually cost. "Then I will earn her trust again," he said quietly, "however long it takes." That night, as preparations for the journey south began in careful secrecy, Draven stood alone in his private chambers, looking at the small portrait of Elena that he had never been able to bring himself to remove from the wall, despite 6 years of trying to move forward. Her painted eyes seemed to look back at him with the same warmth he remembered from their early years together, before duty and law and the cruel calculations of council politics had torn everything apart. Somewhere far to the south, in a coastal town he had never visited, 2 children who carried his blood and his bloodline's ancient mark were growing up without any knowledge of who their father truly was. 2 children whose mother had sacrificed 6 years of safety and stability, moving from town to town, hiding a truth so significant it could reshape the entire future of Blackthorn Pack, all because she had trusted the pack, and the man who ruled it, so little that disappearing entirely seemed safer than staying. He did not blame her for that distrust. He had earned it, fully and completely, on the day he stood before the council and let ancient law override everything he had once sworn to protect. Tomorrow, he would begin the journey to find her. Whatever awaited him in Brindlewood, whatever anger or rejection Elena might rightfully direct toward him, he intended to face it honestly, without the shield of council politics or ancient laws standing between them this time. He owed her that much, and far more besides, after 6 long years of silence that should never have existed at all. The wagon wheels creaked against the packed dirt road, as Elena secured the last crate to the back of the small cart she had rented for the journey. 3 days had passed since the man in the gray coat had watched her children from across the schoolyard fence, and she had spent every one of those days quietly preparing to leave Brindlewood behind. "Are we really leaving?" Lyra asked, standing in the doorway of their small apartment with her favorite doll clutched against her chest. At 6 years old, she had already learned to recognize the particular tension in her mother's movements that meant another move was coming, though this time felt different, more urgent than the careful, gradual preparations of their previous relocations. "We are," Elena said, forcing a reassuring smile, despite the anxiety twisting in her stomach. "There's a lovely town further down the coast, right by the water. You'll like it there." Kai emerged from the apartment carrying the last of their belongings, a small trunk containing what few possessions they owned. He had grown noticeably in the past year, his shoulders broadening in a way that hinted at the powerful build he would eventually carry as an adult, though his face still held all the softness of childhood. "Mama," he said quietly, setting the trunk into the cart, "is this because of what happened at school? With the man watching us?" Elena froze for a moment, surprised that her son had noticed the stranger's presence at all. She had hoped to shield her children from the full weight of her anxiety, but Kai's instincts, sharp even at 8 years old, had apparently picked up on far more than she realized. "You saw him too?" "He was standing by the fence for a long time," Kai said. longer than a normal person would stand there. I didn't like the way he was looking at us. Elena knelt down to his level, taking both his hands in hers. You have very good instincts, and I'm proud of you for trusting them. Yes, that's part of why we're moving. Sometimes it's better to be careful than to wait and see if our worries turn out to be true. The family finished loading the cart just as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the western hills. Elena had arranged passage on a merchant ship departing from the next town over, a journey that would take them nearly 200 miles further south, well beyond any territory the scout in the gray coat might think to search. They traveled through the afternoon and into the early evening, the twins growing quiet and tired as the cart rattled along uneven roads through increasingly unfamiliar countryside. Elena kept a careful watch on the path behind them, though she saw no sign of pursuit, no indication that anyone had noticed their departure from Brindlewood at all. By the time darkness fell, they had reached a small crossroads inn, where Elena had arranged to spend the night, before continuing toward the coast the following morning. She settled her exhausted children into a shared room, tucking blankets around them both, and watching until their breathing evened into the steady rhythm of sleep, before allowing herself to relax even slightly. She sat by the small window of their room for a long while, watching the road outside for any sign of movement, any hint that their careful escape had not gone as smoothly as she hoped. The inn was quiet, populated mostly by traveling merchants, and a handful of families passing through on their own journeys, nothing that suggested any unusual attention directed toward her small family. Eventually, exhaustion overcame her vigilance, and she drifted into an uneasy sleep in the chair beside the window, still fully dressed, ready to move at the first sign of danger. She woke before dawn to the sound of horses in the inn's courtyard below, and her heart immediately began to race. She rose quietly, careful not to wake her children, and moved to the window to peer down at the courtyard. 3 riders had arrived, their horses lathered with the sweat of hard travel, suggesting they had ridden through much of the night to reach the inn. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she studied the tallest of the 3 men dismounting in the gray light of early morning. Even from this distance, even after 6 years of separation, she recognized him instantly. The set of his shoulders, the particular way he moved with the controlled power of a man used to commanding respect without needing to raise his voice, the dark hair that had grown slightly longer than she remembered but remained unmistakably his. Draven. For a long moment, Elena simply stood frozen at the window, unable to process what she was seeing. 6 years of careful hiding, 6 years of building a life so far removed from Blackthorn Pack that discovery had begun to feel like a distant, almost theoretical fear, rather than an immediate threat, and now here he was, standing in the courtyard of the very inn where she had chosen to spend the night, as if fate itself had conspired to bring their paths crashing back together. Her first instinct was pure panic, an overwhelming urge to grab her children and flee through the back of the inn before he could possibly discover their presence. But even as the thought formed, she recognized its impossibility. The twins were still asleep, exhausted from the previous day's travel, and any attempt to move them quickly through the inn's narrow hallways risked drawing exactly the kind of attention she desperately wanted to avoid. She watched, heart pounding painfully against her ribs, as Draven spoke quietly with the innkeeper who had emerged to greet the unexpected early morning arrivals. She could not hear their words from this distance, but she watched the innkeeper's expression shift from sleepy confusion to something more alert, more curious, as the conversation continued. Was he asking about them? Had he somehow traced their journey this far south already? Or was this simply a terrible coincidence, 2 travelers' paths crossing by, pure unfortunate chance at the same crossroads inn on the same morning? She did not have time to determine the answer before she heard small footsteps behind her, and turned to find Lyra rubbing sleep from her eyes, woken by the commotion in the courtyard below. "Mama, what's happening?" "Nothing, sweetheart," Elena said, forcing her voice into calm reassurance despite the terror clawing through her chest. "Just some travelers arriving early. Go back to sleep for a little while longer." But it was too late. Kai too had begun to stir, his sharp instincts picking up on the tension in the room, even through the fog of sleep. He rose from the bed and moved to the window beside his mother, peering down into the courtyard with the same curious attention his father had once shown toward any unfamiliar situation. "Who is that?" he asked, watching Draven move with the innkeeper toward the inn's entrance. Elena's mind raced through possible answers, but before she could formulate a response, The decision was taken entirely out of her hands. Below in the courtyard, one of the two guards accompanying Draven happened to glance upward toward the inn's second floor, and his eyes locked directly onto the window where Elena stood with both her children beside her. The guard's expression shifted immediately from casual alertness to sharp recognition, and he turned quickly to speak urgent words to Draven, gesturing up toward their window. Elena watched, frozen with dread, as Draven's head snapped upward, his eyes finding hers across the distance of the courtyard below. For one long, suspended moment, neither of them moved. 6 years of separation, 6 years of grief and hiding, and rebuilding entire lives from nothing, all condensed into a single breathless heartbeat as their eyes met for the first time since that terrible night in the great hall of Blackthorn Pack. Then Draven moved, striding toward the inn's entrance with a purposeful speed that left no doubt about his intentions. "Mama?" Kai said, his voice tight with instinctive alarm, at whatever he sensed shifting in his mother's demeanor. "Who is that man? Why is he looking at us like that?" Elena turned to her children, kneeling quickly to bring herself to their eye level, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped their shoulders. There was no time now for careful, gentle explanations, no time to prepare them slowly for a truth she had spent 6 years protecting them from. "Listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice low and urgent. "That man downstairs, he might be someone very important to our family, someone I've told you about before, though not by name. I need you both to stay calm, and stay close to me, no matter what happens next. Can you do that?" Lyra's eyes widened with sudden understanding, connecting pieces of information she had been quietly gathering for years. Is that our father?" Elena's breath caught, and she nodded slowly, unable to find words adequate to the moment. Heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs outside their room, growing closer with each passing second. Elena rose to her feet, positioning herself protectively between her children and the door, her heart hammering with a chaotic mixture of fear, anger, and an emotion she refused to examine too closely, something that felt uncomfortably close to relief. The footsteps stopped just outside their door, and for a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the ragged sound of Draven's breathing on the other side of the thin wooden panel, as if he too needed a moment to gather himself before whatever confrontation awaited on the other side. Then, slowly, the door opened. Draven stood in the doorway, and up close, Elena could see the 6 years had changed him too. Fine lines had appeared at the corners of his eyes, and there was a weariness in his posture that had not been there before, the weight of years, spent ruling alone, pressing visibly on his shoulders. But his eyes, when they met hers again, held the same intensity she remembered, now sharpened by an emotion she could not quite name. His gaze moved past her, to the two children standing close behind their mother, and Elena watched something break open across his features as he truly saw them for the first time. Kai, with his father's dark hair and the beginning of his father's broad-shouldered build. Lyra, with eyes that mirrored Draven's own with startling precision. "Elena," Draven said, his voice rough with an emotion that seemed to steal the breath from his lungs entirely. Are they? He could not finish the question, but he did not need to. The answer was written plainly across both children's faces, undeniable proof of exactly what he had traveled so far and so urgently to discover. Elena straightened her spine, meeting his eyes with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, though 6 years of surviving alone had taught her how to project strength even when her insides trembled with uncertainty. "Yes," she said simply. "These are your children, Kai and Lyra, and you should know, before you say anything else, that I will not let you take them from the only life they have ever known." The declaration hung in the small room between them, 6 years of secrets and survival compressed into a single fierce sentence, while behind her, both children watched the stranger who claimed to be their father, with wide, uncertain eyes, waiting to see what would happen next in a story that had suddenly, irrevocably, changed course. Draven took a slow step into the room, his hands raised slightly at his sides in a gesture meant to convey peace rather than threat, though every instinct in his body screamed at him to cross the remaining distance and pull his children into his arms. "I am not here to take them from you," he said quietly. "I swear it, Elena. I only wanted to see for myself if the reports were true." "What reports?" Elena's voice remained sharp, guarded, though Draven could see the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides, betraying the calm she was trying so hard to project. A scout in Brindlewood observed Kai's strength during an incident at his school. The report made its way to Blackthorn through an alliance with an eastern pack. Draven kept his voice low and even, aware of how carefully he needed to tread in this moment, aware that one wrong word might shatter whatever fragile opportunity for conversation still existed. I only learned of it 3 days ago. I came as quickly as I could, but I traveled with only 2 guards, no announcement, no political purpose. I came because I needed to know the truth. Elena's expression flickered with something like surprise, though she quickly masked it beneath continued wariness. You expect me to believe that, after everything? I expect nothing, Draven said. I only ask for the chance to explain myself, and to know my children, if you'll permit it. Behind their mother, Kai had been studying the stranger with careful, calculating attention, the same instinctive assessment he brought to any unfamiliar situation. Now, emboldened perhaps by his father's calm demeanor, he stepped slightly out from behind Elena's protective stance. You're the king she told us about, he said, his young voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. The one who loved his people very much. Draven's composure cracked slightly at those words, emotion flickering across his weathered features. Your mother told you that? She said things happened that made it impossible for you to stay together, Lyra added, peeking around Elena's other side with the same searching curiosity that had always characterized her nature. She wouldn't tell us why. Gladed Draven's eyes met Elena's again, and this time, something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of 6 years of pain neither of them had ever fully processed. The why is complicated, he said slowly, choosing his words carefully for the sake of the children listening so intently. And it is entirely my fault, not your mother's. I made a decision, a long time ago, based on bad information and worse advice, and it cost all of us more than I can properly express. Elena's jaw tightened, old anger resurfacing, despite 6 years of trying to release it. Bad information. Is that what we're calling it now? You banished me in front of the entire pack, Draven. You told me the law required it, that there was no other choice, and I believed you, because I trusted you completely. And it turns out the healers who declared me Barren were simply wrong. I know, Draven said, and the raw guilt in his voice was undeniable, impossible to fake or perform. I have thought of nothing else for 6 years. I tried, more than once, to accept another mate, to move forward the way the council demanded. The bonding mark never responded to anyone else, not once. This admission seemed to catch Elena off guard, and for a moment, her carefully maintained composure wavered. She had assumed, in the years since her exile, that Draven had moved forward entirely, had perhaps found a new Luna, and settled into the political marriage his advisors had always wanted for him. The thought that he had struggled, that some part of their bond had refused to release him despite everything, stirred emotions she had worked hard to bury. That doesn't undo what happened, she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier edge. No, Draven agreed. Nothing can undo it. But I am asking, humbly, for the chance to be part of my children's lives, however that might look, on whatever terms you're willing to allow. I am not here to demand anything, Elena. I only want to know them, and if you'll permit it, to help protect them, because I suspect you already know that the danger which drove that scout to investigate Kai's abilities in the first place has not disappeared simply because we're having this conversation. Elena's expression shifted, practical concern momentarily overtaking her personal grievances. What do you mean? The scout who observed Kai works for a pack in the Eastern Territories, one that has grown increasingly ambitious in recent years, testing the boundaries of alliances and territories that have held stable for generations. If they learn the full truth of what they observed, that the boy displaying unusual strength carries Blackthorn's royal bloodline mark, they may see an opportunity rather than a mere curiosity. An opportunity to either eliminate a threat to their own ambitions, or to capture leverage they could use against Blackthorn directly. The color drained slightly from Elena's face as the full weight of Draven's words settled over her. She had worried for years about generalized dangers, vague political threats that had driven her from town to town, but hearing the specific, concrete possibility laid out so plainly filled her with a fear sharper than anything she had experienced during her long years of hiding. You're saying they might try to hurt them. she said quietly. Or take them. I am saying it is a possibility I cannot ignore, and neither should you, Draven said. Whatever you decide about my role in your lives going forward, I would ask that you at least allow me to help ensure their safety. Blackthorn has resources, protections, ways of shielding them from exactly this kind of threat that a single mother hiding in human towns, however resourceful, cannot fully provide alone. Elena looked back at her children, both of them watching this exchange with wide, uncertain eyes, absorbing far more of the conversation's weight than either parent might have wished. She thought of the man in the gray coat watching them from across the schoolyard fence, of the careful vigilance she had maintained for 6 long years, of the exhausting cycle of building a life only to abandon it and start again the moment danger seemed to draw too close. She thought, too, of the years ahead, of Kai and Lyra growing older, their unusual strength and instincts becoming harder to conceal as they approached their teenage years, the burden of secrecy growing heavier with each passing season. She had always known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that hiding forever was likely an impossible goal, that eventually the truth of her children's heritage would find a way to surface, regardless of how carefully she tried to suppress it. I need time to think, she said finally, her voice quieter now, some of the earlier fire, tempered by the practical weight of Draven's warnings. This is not a decision I can make in a single conversation, standing in a crossroads inn, with our children listening to every word. Of course, Draven said quickly. Take whatever time you need. I am not here to rush you, or to force anything upon you. I only ask that you consider allowing me to remain nearby, or at the very least, to remain in contact, so that whatever decision you reach, I might have the chance to prove myself worthy of whatever role you're willing to grant me. Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of the calculating political manipulation she might have expected from a king so long accustomed to command. She found instead only exhaustion, guilt, and something that looked remarkably like fear. The fear of a man who had already lost 6 years he could never reclaim, and desperately did not wish to lose more. There's an inn 2 towns south of here, near the coast, she said finally. We're traveling there today, to a fishing town called Millbrook. You may follow, if you wish, and we can speak further once the children and I have had time to rest and process everything that has happened this morning. Draven nodded immediately, relief evident in the loosening of his tense shoulders. Thank you, Elena. Truly. As he turned to leave the room, giving them space to prepare for the day's continued travel, Kai spoke up suddenly, his young voice carrying a directness that made both adults pause. Will you tell us more about being a king? He asked. Mama never explained much. Draven turned back, and for the first time since his arrival, something like a genuine smile touched his weathered features, though it remained tinged with the sorrow of 6 lost years. I would be honored to, whenever your mother thinks the time is right. As the door closed behind him, Elena sank slowly onto the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath the weight of everything that had just transpired. 6 years of careful hiding, unraveled in the span of a single morning, and now she faced a decision more complicated than any she had confronted since the day she first learned she was pregnant in that small healer's cottage in Ashford. Lyra climbed onto the bed beside her, resting her head against Elena's shoulder with the trusting affection of a child seeking comfort. Are we going to be okay, Mama? Elena wrapped her arm around her daughter, pulling Kai close on her other side as well, and though uncertainty churned violently beneath her calm exterior, she found herself answering with more conviction than she expected to feel. We're going to be okay, she said. Whatever happens next, I promise you both, we will face it together. Outside, in the inn's courtyard, Draven stood beside his waiting horse, staring up at the window of the room where his children had just learned, for the first time, the true nature of the father they had never known. 6 years of regret settled heavily in his chest, mixed now with a fragile, cautious hope that perhaps, despite everything, some version of a future together might still be possible. The road ahead remained uncertain, filled with dangers both political and personal that none of them could fully anticipate. But for the first time in 6 long years, Draven allowed himself to believe that the family he had lost through a moment of weakness and misplaced trust in flawed counsel might yet find a way back to something resembling wholeness. Whatever it cost him, however long it took to earn back Elena's trust and to properly know the children who had grown up entirely without him, he resolved, standing in that quiet courtyard as the morning sun climbed higher over the eastern hills, that he would not fail them again. The fishing town of Millbrook smelled of salt and drying nets, and the small inn Elena had chosen sat perched on a rocky bluff overlooking the harbor, its windows offering a clear view of the boats bobbing gently against their moorings below. Draven arrived several hours after Elena and the twins, having deliberately kept his distance during the day's travel to give them space, though every mile of the journey had felt agonizingly slow. He found Elena sitting alone on a bench outside the inn as evening settled over the harbor, the twins apparently occupied elsewhere, perhaps resting after the long day's travel. She did not look up as he approached, though he suspected she had heard his footsteps long before he reached her. "They're asleep," she said, answering the unspoken question. "Exhausted from everything. I thought it might be easier to talk without them listening to every word." Draven lowered himself onto the opposite end of the bench, leaving a careful distance between them, unsure whether closeness would be welcomed or resented. "Thank you for allowing me to follow you here." Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching the fishing boats sway with the incoming tide. "I've imagined this conversation many times over the years," she said finally. "In my imagination, I always had perfect words ready. Everything I wanted to say to you laid out clearly and calmly. Now that you're actually here, I find I don't know where to begin." "Begin wherever feels right," Draven said quietly. "I owe you the patience to listen, however long it takes." Elena turned to face him fully, for the first time since their arrival at the inn, and Draven saw an entire 6 years of complicated emotions swirling behind her eyes, anger and exhaustion and grief, all tangled together, with something that might have been the faint, stubborn remnant of old affection she had never quite managed to fully extinguish. "Do you know what it felt like?" she began, her voice steady despite the intensity building beneath it. "To stand in that hall and hear the man I loved speak the words that ended everything we had built together. Not privately, not with any gentleness, but in front of the entire pack, as if I were simply an item being returned for a manufacturing defect." Draven flinched visibly at the description, but he did not look away, did not offer excuses or deflections. "No," he admitted, "I cannot fully know what that felt like from your side. I only know what it felt like from mine, watching myself do something I somehow believed was necessary, while every part of me was screaming that it was wrong." "Then why did you do it?" The question came out sharper than she intended. 6 years of buried pain finally finding an outlet. "If you knew it was wrong, why didn't you stop it? You were the Alpha King, Draven, the most powerful man in Blackthorn territory. You could have refused the council. You could have told them the old law was cruel and outdated, and that you would find another way to secure the pack's future. Instead, you let them convince you to throw away everything we had." Draven was silent for a long moment, staring out at the darkening harbor as he searched for an honest answer, one that did not simply offer excuses, but confronted the truth of his own failure directly. "I was young," he said finally, "not in years perhaps, but in wisdom. I had been raised my entire life to believe that Blackthorn's survival depended on unbroken succession, that the bloodline had to continue directly through an heir born of the Alpha and his mate, or the entire structure of the pack would weaken and eventually collapse under the ambitions of rival territories. I had never questioned this belief because no one before me had ever needed to. Every Alpha before me had produced an heir. I was the first to face the possibility of failure, and I did not have the wisdom or the courage to challenge 300 years of tradition, even when that tradition demanded I sacrifice the woman I loved." "That's not an excuse," Elena said, though some of the sharp edge had faded from her voice, replaced by something more contemplative. "No," Draven agreed. "It is not an excuse. It is simply the truth of my failure, laid bare without dressing it in anything prettier than what it actually was. I chose tradition and fear over you, Elena, and I have spent 6 years living with the consequences of that choice, watching every attempt to move forward fail, because some part of me, apparently the most honest part, refused to accept anyone but you." Elena studied him carefully, searching his face for any hint of manipulation or performance, but found only raw, uncomfortable honesty. "The bonding mark," she said slowly. "You mentioned it never responded to anyone else." Draven nodded, reaching up to touch the space over his heart where the mark had lived, unresponsive and cold, through 3 failed attempts at forming a new bond. "It has remained exactly as it was on the day of our first bonding." I have felt nothing since, no matter how many times my advisors insisted a new bond was simply a matter of proper ritual and patience. And what do you feel now? Elena asked, the question carrying more weight than its simple words suggested. Sitting here, 6 years later, with everything that's happened between us? Draven met her eyes directly, refusing to hide behind careful political language. I feel the same warmth I felt the very first time I touched your hand, he said quietly. It never left, Elena, not for a single day of these 6 years. I simply buried it beneath duty and guilt, because I did not believe I deserved to feel it after what I had done to you. The confession hung between them in the salt-scented evening air, heavier and more vulnerable than anything either of them had expected to voice so directly. Elena felt her carefully maintained composure wavering, old feelings she had worked hard to suppress, rising unbidden to the surface. I hated you, she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. For years, I hated you so completely that I thought the feeling might consume everything else inside me. And then, somewhere along the way, the hatred started to fade into something more complicated, something I couldn't quite name. I told myself it was simply exhaustion, that I was too tired from raising 2 children alone to maintain that level of anger. But I think, if I'm honest with myself, some part of me never stopped hoping you might eventually understand what you had lost. I understand it now, Draven said. Perhaps too late to undo the damage, but I understand it completely. They sat in silence for a while after that, the weight of their shared history settling between them, alongside the sound of waves lapping gently against the harbor's rocky shore. Finally, Elena spoke again, her voice more measured now, practical concerns beginning to reassert themselves over raw emotion. Even if I were willing to consider allowing you back into our lives, she said, there are things that need to change. I will not raise my children in a court that values them only as political assets, only as proof of a bloodline's continued strength. If they are ever going to know Blackthorn Pack, they need to be valued as people first, as children who deserve love and protection, regardless of what they might someday inherit. I agree completely, Draven said immediately, and I intend to make that clear to the council, in no uncertain terms, the moment we return. The Exile ruling was wrong, based on flawed information and outdated tradition, and I will overturn it publicly, acknowledging both the error and my own failure in allowing it to stand unchallenged. That won't be simple, Elena warned. Overturning centuries of tradition, admitting the king was wrong in front of the entire council, that kind of public reckoning could destabilize Blackthorn's political standing at exactly the moment when Kai and Lyra's existence makes them targets for exactly the kind of rival ambition you warned me about earlier today. I know, Draven said, but continuing to hide the truth carries its own dangers. Dangers that grew immediately more urgent the moment that Scout observed Kai's strength in Brindlewood. Whatever difficulties come with acknowledging the truth publicly, I believe they are preferable to the alternative of continuing to leave you and the children vulnerable, unprotected by anything, except your own resourcefulness and constant vigilance. Elena considered this for a long moment, weighing the exhausting cycle of hiding she had maintained for 6 years against the uncertain, but potentially more stable protection Blackthorn's resources might provide. Neither option felt entirely safe, but one, at least, offered the possibility of an end to the constant running, the endless cycle of building and abandoning lives in service of secrecy. I need to speak with the children about this properly, she said finally. Not just tell them what's happening, but actually include them in the decision as much as their age allows. This affects their entire future, and I won't make choices about their lives without at least hearing their thoughts and fears. Of course, Draven agreed. Whatever process you feel is right, I will respect it completely. As if summoned by the conversation, the inn's door opened behind them, and Kai stepped out into the evening air, apparently having woken from his rest and noticed his mother's absence. He hesitated at the sight of both parents sitting together, uncertain whether he was interrupting something important, but Elena waved him over with a gentle smile. Come sit with us, she said. Your father and I were just discussing some important things, and I think it's time we included you and your sister in the conversation. Kai approached cautiously, settling onto the bench beside his mother while studying Draven with the same careful assessment he had shown throughout their earlier encounter. Are you going to be around now? He asked directly, his young mind cutting straight to the heart of the matter with characteristic bluntness. Draven considered the question seriously before answering, understanding that whatever he said now would shape his son's expectations and trust for whatever relationship might develop between them going forward. I would like to be, he said honestly, very much, but that decision belongs to your mother, and to you and your sister as well. I have already caused enough harm by being absent for 6 years. I do not wish to cause further harm by forcing myself into your lives, if that is not what any of you truly want. Kai studied his father's face for a long moment, an unusually serious expression for a child his age, settling across his features. Mama said you loved your people very much, he said finally. Do you think you could love us too, even though we're not really part of that world yet? The question struck Draven with unexpected force, and he found himself momentarily unable to speak past the emotion tightening his throat. He knelt down slightly, bringing himself closer to his son's eye level, an instinctive gesture that mirrored countless similar moments he had witnessed other parents share with their children over the years, moments he had never expected to experience himself. I already do, he said quietly, honestly. I have loved you both since the moment I learned you existed, even before I truly knew you. That kind of love doesn't require time or proximity to be real, Kai. It was simply waiting for the chance to be expressed. Kai's serious expression softened slightly, though uncertainty still lingered in his eyes, the natural caution of a child who had spent his entire life learning to be careful about trust. But something in his father's honest answer seemed to ease at least a portion of that caution, opening a small door toward the possibility of a relationship neither of them had ever expected to have the chance to build. As the evening deepened into full darkness over Millbrook's quiet harbor, the small family sat together for the first time in 6 years, tentative and uncertain, but no longer entirely divided by the weight of secrets and separation that had defined their lives for so long. The road ahead remained complicated, filled with political challenges and lingering danger from forces neither Elena nor Draven could fully control. But for this one quiet evening, sitting together beside the gently swaying fishing boats, something resembling the beginning of healing had finally, cautiously, begun to take root. 3 weeks passed in Millbrook, and during that time, a careful, tentative rhythm began to establish itself among the small family that had so unexpectedly reunited on that rocky coastal bluff. Draven had rented a cottage near the harbor, close enough to Elena's inn that he could visit each day without imposing on their space entirely, giving both mother and children the room they needed to adjust to his sudden reappearance in their lives. He spent his mornings with Kai and Lyra, teaching them small things about their heritage that Elena had never been able to safely explain, stories of Blackthorn Pack's history, gentle lessons about controlling and understanding their growing strength, patient explanations of what it meant to be part of a shifter bloodline. Lyra warmed to him more quickly than her brother, her natural curiosity overriding whatever caution she might have otherwise maintained. She peppered him with endless questions during their morning walks along the harbor, wanting to know everything about the pack he ruled, the forests where he had grown up, the traditions and celebrations that marked life among their people. Will I get to see it someday? She asked one morning, skipping along the rocky path beside him, while gulls wheeled overhead in the salt-scented air. Blackthorn, I mean. The real place, not just the stories. I hope so, Draven said carefully, aware that any promises he made needed to account for decisions still pending. Decisions that ultimately belonged to Elena rather than himself. Whether and when that happens depends on many things, but I would be honored to show you where I grew up, if your mother agrees it's the right time. Kai remained more reserved throughout those early weeks, watching his father with the same careful, evaluating attention he brought to any new situation, testing consistency rather than accepting kind words at face value. He noticed things his sister overlooked, the small stiffness in Draven's posture during particularly emotional conversations, the way certain topics seemed to cause visible discomfort, the careful control Draven exercised over every interaction, as if constantly aware of how much trust remained to be earned. One afternoon, as father and son walked together along the harbor, while Elena and Lyra visited the local market, Kai finally voiced the question that had clearly been weighing on him since their arrival in Millbrook. What happens if the council doesn't want to change the old law? He asked, his voice carrying the particular bluntness that seemed to characterize most of his important questions. What if they still think Mama shouldn't have been allowed to stay, even though she wasn't actually barren like they said? Draven considered the question seriously, recognizing that his son deserved an honest answer, rather than empty reassurance. That is a real possibility, he admitted. Tradition carries enormous weight in pack politics, and some council members may resist any change, regardless of how clearly the old ruling has been proven wrong. But I am the Alpha King, Kai, and while I must work with the council on many matters, I retain the authority to overturn a specific ruling when new evidence demonstrates it was made in error. I intend to use that authority, whatever resistance I encounter. But won't that make people angry? Kai pressed. Mama said something like that could make Blackthorn look weak to other packs. Draven found himself impressed, not for the first time, by his son's sharp political instincts, an awareness of consequence and strategy that seemed unusually developed for a child his age. It is a risk, he acknowledged, but I believe the alternative, continuing to enforce an unjust ruling simply to avoid appearing weak, causes far greater harm in the long term. A king who cannot admit error when the evidence demands it is not a strong king. He is simply a stubborn one, and stubbornness has broken far more kingdoms throughout history than honest correction ever has. Kai walked in thoughtful silence for a while, processing his father's answer with the same careful consideration he applied to everything. I think I understand, he said finally. It's like at school, when Lyra and I had to decide whether to keep our strength hidden or let people see it, if it meant protecting someone. Sometimes, doing the right thing costs something, but you have to do it anyway. Draven felt something warm and proud unfurl in his chest at his son's insight, an understanding of moral courage that seemed to have developed naturally despite, or perhaps because of, the difficult circumstances of his upbringing. Exactly, he said. You have good instincts, Kai. Better than many advisors I've known who have spent decades in political circles without ever grasping that simple truth. Meanwhile, back at the inn, Elena had begun corresponding with Charles through a series of carefully worded letters, coordinating the logistics of what would need to happen if she ultimately agreed to return to Blackthorn territory with the children. Charles, for his part, had proven surprisingly supportive of Draven's intentions to overturn the Exile ruling, having apparently witnessed firsthand the toll 6 years of guilt and unresolved grief had taken on his king. The council will not accept this easily, Charles wrote in one particularly detailed letter, which Elena read carefully by candlelight after the children had gone to sleep. There are factions who have grown comfortable with the current arrangement, who see political advantage in the possibility of a new mate alliance for the king, one that might strengthen ties with other territories rather than restoring a bond that offers no such political benefit. You should expect resistance, perhaps significant resistance, when the truth of the twins' existence becomes public knowledge. Elena set the letter aside, staring out at the darkened harbor while considering the weight of Charles's warning. She had spent 6 years hiding from exactly this kind of political calculation, the reduction of her children to assets valued only for the alliances or advantages they might represent. The thought of returning to a world where such calculations remained active, even if Draven himself had changed his approach, filled her with lingering unease. But she also thought of the alternative, the exhausting cycle of constant movement, the fear that had followed her family from town to town for 6 long years. The very real danger that Scout in Brindlewood had represented, a danger that would only grow more acute as Kai and Lyra aged, and their abilities became increasingly difficult to conceal. Whatever risks accompanied a return to Blackthorn, they came paired with the possibility of genuine protection, resources, and stability that she could never fully provide alone, however resourceful and determined she remained. She discussed these considerations openly with the twins over the following days, careful to present both the potential benefits and the real dangers, without minimizing either side of the decision. To her surprise, both children, despite their youth, engaged with the conversation more thoughtfully than she had expected, asking pointed questions and offering their own perspectives with a maturity that spoke to how much the years of careful, honest communication within their small family had prepared them for this moment. I don't want to keep moving all the time, Lyra said during one such conversation, curled against Elena's side on the small bed they shared at the inn. I like having a place that feels like home. Even if Blackthorn is scary at first, maybe it could become that, eventually. Kai's perspective proved more cautious, but ultimately aligned with his sister's underlying sentiment. I think we should try it, he said slowly. But I want you to promise, Mama, that if it becomes like it was before, if people there try to make us feel like we're just Just prizes instead of people. We can leave again. We don't have to stay if it's not right. I promise, Elena said, pulling both children close against her. Whatever we decide, this will never be a decision without an exit. I will not trap either of you in a situation that harms you, no matter how much political pressure surrounds us. With her children's cautious support secured, Elena finally approached Draven with her decision, meeting him one evening on the same bench where their difficult conversation had first begun weeks earlier. I will return to Blackthorn, she said, watching his expression carefully for any sign of the political calculation she still half expected despite weeks of careful, honest interaction. But there are conditions, Draven, and I need your absolute commitment to them before we take a single step toward your territory. Tell me, Draven said, his attention completely focused on her words. The exile must be publicly and formally overturned, with a clear acknowledgement that the original ruling was made in error. I will not return quietly, as if slipping back into a position I was wrongfully denied. The council needs to understand, unambiguously, that what happened to me was unjust. Draven nodded immediately. I have already begun drafting the formal statement I intend to present. Charles has been assisting me in preparing the language, though the final decision on content and delivery remains entirely mine. Second, Elena continued, Kai and Lyra will be treated as children first, and heirs second, in every practical sense, not merely in rhetoric. Their education, their friendships, their daily lives should reflect childhood, not political preparation for a throne they may not even want someday. Agreed completely, Draven said. I want them to have the chance to be children in ways I perhaps never fully experienced myself, given how early my own training as heir began. Third, Elena said, her voice growing quieter but no less firm. Whatever happens between you and me personally, whatever relationship we do or do not eventually rebuild, it cannot be rushed or assumed, simply because we are returning to Blackthorn together. I need time, Draven, real time, to determine what I want for myself, separate from what might be politically convenient or emotionally easier for either of us. Draven met her eyes steadily, and Elena saw in his expression the same patient honesty that had slowly, cautiously begun rebuilding her trust over these past weeks. I would never ask you to rush that decision, he said. I have already caused enough damage by moving too quickly, by letting fear and pressure override careful consideration once before. I will not make that mistake again, with anything that matters this much. Elena studied him for a long moment, searching for any hint of insincerity in his answer, and finding none. Finally, she extended her hand toward him, a gesture that carried far more weight than its simplicity might suggest, an offer of tentative partnership, rather than the full reconciliation neither of them was yet prepared to claim. Draven took her hand carefully, and as their fingers touched, both of them felt the familiar warmth of the old bonding mark stir gently to life, not with the overwhelming intensity of their first bonding all those years ago, but with a quiet, steady presence that suggested the connection between them, however damaged, had never truly been broken at all. Then we begin again, Elena said softly, carefully, and on our own terms this time. Carefully, Draven agreed, and on your terms, always. As preparations began for the journey north to Blackthorn territory, neither Elena nor Draven could fully anticipate the challenges that awaited them there, the political resistance Charles had warned of, and the darker threats still gathering beyond the pack's borders from rivals who had already begun to suspect the truth of the twins' existence. But for the first time in 6 years, both of them faced that uncertain future, with something they had not expected to feel again, a fragile, cautious sense of hope, built not on empty promises, but on the slow, patient work of rebuilding trust, one honest conversation at a time. The forest surrounding Blackthorn territory had changed little in 6 years, and yet Elena felt her heart pounding with unfamiliar anxiety as the small traveling party crossed the border markers she had once walked away from in grief and heartbreak. Kai and Lyra rode in a covered wagon beside her, their faces pressed against the small window openings, taking in their first glimpse of the towering pine forests and distant stone towers that marked their father's homeland. Draven rode ahead alongside 2 guards, his posture alert and watchful, aware that their return, however carefully planned, still carried significant risk, given everything Charles had warned about regarding rival factions and political resistance. They had traveled for nearly 2 weeks, moving cautiously and avoiding major roads where possible, though Draven had insisted on a proper escort for at least the final approach to Blackthorn territory, unwilling to leave his family vulnerable during such a critical journey. What none of them yet knew was that word of their approach had already reached ears far beyond Blackthorn's borders. In the Eastern Territories, a pack calling itself the Ashgrove Alliance had been quietly expanding its influence for nearly a decade, absorbing smaller packs through a combination of political maneuvering and occasional, carefully deniable force. Their alpha, a calculating man named Gareth, had built his ambitions on a simple, patient strategy: wait for the great northern powers to show weakness, then position his own pack to claim whatever territory or influence became available in the resulting chaos. The report about Kai's unusual strength, originally commissioned through a minor southern pack and forwarded to Blackthorn as a diplomatic courtesy, had also passed, through a less official channel, into Gareth's hands. His own network of informants, less scrupulous than the official diplomatic pathways, had confirmed the boy's connection to Blackthorn's royal bloodline within days of Draven's departure south to investigate the reports himself. Gareth had spent those following weeks calculating exactly how this unexpected development might serve his own ambitions. A public reversal of Blackthorn's exile ruling, acknowledging the previous king's error and restoring an outcast Luna alongside two newly discovered heirs, would represent a significant destabilization within Blackthorn's political structure, precisely the kind of vulnerability Gareth had been patiently waiting years to exploit. His plan, when it finally solidified, was elegant in its ruthless simplicity. If the twins could be captured before Draven's public acknowledgement of their existence, before the Pack Council and allied territories learned officially of their legitimacy, Gareth could use them as powerful leverage, either demanding significant territorial concessions from Blackthorn in exchange for their safe return, or, should negotiations prove difficult, simply eliminating any legitimate heir to the throne, ensuring Blackthorn's succession crisis remained permanently unresolved and vulnerable to further exploitation. He dispatched a small team of his most trusted and ruthless operatives to intercept the traveling family before they could complete their journey to the safety of Blackthorn's fortified territory, timing their approach to coincide with what his informants indicated would be a particularly vulnerable stretch of forest road, still several miles outside the protection of Blackthorn's border patrols. Elena noticed the shift in the forest's atmosphere before anyone else in the traveling party. Years of constant vigilance while raising her children in hiding had honed her instincts to a fine edge, and something about the unusual stillness settling over the surrounding trees, the absence of ordinary birdsong, sent a cold wave of alarm rushing through her entire body. "Draven," she called out, urgency sharpening her voice. "Something is wrong." Draven, whose own alpha instincts had been trained through years of leadership to recognize similar warning signs, immediately raised a hand to signal the party to halt, his eyes scanning the surrounding tree line with sharp, focused attention. "Guards, positions," he called, his voice carrying the immediate authority of command. The two guards accompanying them moved swiftly to flank the wagon, their hands moving to weapons carried at their sides. The attack came within moments of Draven's warning, 6 figures emerging simultaneously from the concealment of the surrounding forest, moving with the coordinated precision of trained operatives, rather than the disorganized aggression of common bandits. "Protect the children," Draven shouted, already shifting into his wolf form with the fluid speed of a lifetime's practice, his powerful frame doubling in size as fur the color of deep midnight rippled across his transforming body. Inside the wagon, Elena grabbed both her children and pulled them down against the floor, her heart hammering with a terror sharper than anything she had experienced during 6 years of careful hiding. "Stay down," she commanded, her voice tight with controlled panic. "No matter what you hear, stay down and stay quiet." Outside, chaos erupted. As Draven's guards moved to engage the attacking operatives, the clash of shifted wolves and desperate combat, filling the previously peaceful forest with sounds of violence. Draven himself moved with devastating efficiency, his years of combat training and raw alpha strength allowing him to dispatch 2 attackers within the first frantic minutes of the confrontation. But Gareth's operatives had prepared carefully for this encounter, and even as Draven fought off the initial assault, one figure broke away from the main confrontation, moving with deliberate speed toward the wagon, where Elena and the children remained hidden. Kai heard the approaching footsteps before his mother did, his enhanced senses picking up the subtle shift in sound against the wagon's canvas covering. Without hesitation, despite his mother's earlier instruction to remain hidden, he moved instinctively to position himself between the wagon's entrance and his sister, a protective reflex that had defined his character since the earliest days of his childhood. The attacker tore through the canvas covering with a sharp blade, revealing a broad-shouldered man with cold, calculating eyes that swept immediately toward the children cowering within. "There you are," he said, a note of satisfaction coloring his voice as he reached toward Kai with obvious intent to seize him. What happened next occurred faster than any of them could fully process. Kai, drawing on instincts and strength he had never fully tested before this moment, moved with a speed that startled even himself, grabbing the attacker's outstretched arm and twisting with a force that sent the much larger man stumbling backward with a cry of pained surprise. Elena, seizing the momentary opening, pulled both children further back into the wagon, while shouting for help at the top of her lungs. Her cry reached Draven, even amid the ongoing chaos of combat, and he turned instantly, abandoning his current opponent, to race toward the wagon, with a speed born of pure protective terror. He reached the wagon just as the attacker, recovering from Kai's unexpected resistance, drew a second weapon and lunged toward the children once more. Draven's massive wolf form intercepted the attack before it could reach its target, his powerful jaws closing around the man's arm with enough force to make the intention clear without inflicting lasting harm. A controlled display of dominance, rather than the killing blow his instincts screamed for him to deliver. The remaining attackers, seeing their companions subdued and recognizing the tide of battle turning decisively against them as Blackthorn's border patrol, alerted by the sounds of conflict, began arriving to reinforce Draven's small party, made the calculated decision to retreat rather than risk further losses. Within minutes, the forest fell silent once more, the immediate threat neutralized, though the deeper danger it represented remained very much alive. Draven shifted back to his human form immediately, rushing to the wagon where Elena held both children close against her chest, all three of them shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough with barely controlled panic as he examined each of them for injury. "We're okay," Elena managed, though her voice trembled with the lingering shock of the encounter. "Kai, he protected Lyra. He protected all of us." Draven turned to his son, seeing for the first time the full evidence of the strength and courage the boy had displayed during the attack. "You fought him off," he said, something between awe and fierce pride coloring his voice. Kai, still trembling slightly from the encounter, nodded shakily. "I didn't think about it. I just knew I had to stop him from getting to Lyra." "You did exactly right," Draven said, pulling his son into a tight embrace that Kai, despite his usual reserve, did not resist. "You protected your family, exactly as I hope you'll always be brave enough to do, though I pray you never have to face something like this again." As Blackthorn's border patrol secured the area and began questioning the captured attacker, Charles arrived on horseback, having been alerted to the disturbance by scouts monitoring the border approaches. His expression, upon learning the details of the ambush, shifted quickly from concern to grim determination. "This confirms our worst fears," he said, examining the distinctive markings on the captured operatives' equipment. "These are Ashgrove operatives, my king. Gareth has apparently learned of the twins' existence and moved to exploit the situation before we could complete the public reversal of the Exile ruling." Draven's expression hardened with barely controlled fury as he processed the full implications of Charles's assessment. "He tried to take my children," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "He sent operatives to harm or capture Kai and Lyra before they had even set foot in their father's territory." "We should return to the fortress immediately," Charles urged. "Your family requires proper protection, and we need to convene the council to address this threat directly. Both the political question of the Exile reversal and the immediate security concerns raised by Gareth's aggressive action." Elena, still holding her children close, looked toward Draven with an expression that combined lingering fear with fierce determination. "I will not let this stop us," she said firmly. "If anything, this proves exactly why we need Blackthorn's protection, rather than continuing to face these dangers alone. But Draven, we need real security, not just promises. My children nearly died today." "They will have it," Draven said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a king whose priorities had crystallized with sudden, terrible clarity. I will not allow Gareth or any other rival faction to threaten my family again. Whatever resources Blackthorn possesses, whatever alliances need to be strengthened or renegotiated, I will ensure Kai and Lyra receive protection worthy of their status as legitimate heirs to this throne. The journey to Blackthorn's central fortress continued with heightened security, additional guards summoned from the nearest patrol stations to reinforce their escort for the remainder of the approach. Kai and Lyra, though shaken by the encounter, displayed remarkable resilience as the journey continued, their earlier fear gradually transforming into a kind of grim determination that mirrored their father's own hardening resolve. As the towering stone walls of Blackthorn's fortress finally came into view through the forest canopy, Elena felt a complicated mixture of emotions settling over her, relief at reaching the promised safety of proper protection, mixed with renewed anxiety about the political battles that still awaited them within those ancient walls, and a fierce, protective anger toward Gareth and the Ashgrove alliance that had dared threaten her children before they had even completed their journey home. Whatever peace and stability she had hoped this return might offer, it was now clear that achieving it would require far more than simply overturning an old exile ruling. It would require confronting external enemies determined to exploit Blackthorn's vulnerability, enemies who had already demonstrated a willingness to harm innocent children in pursuit of their political ambitions. As their party finally passed through Blackthorn's main gates, greeted by a mixture of curious and wary glances from pack members who had not yet learned the full truth of who traveled among them, Elena tightened her grip on her children's hands and steeled herself for whatever challenges awaited within these walls, determined that after everything her family had already survived, no threat, however powerful or persistent, would succeed in tearing them apart again. The great hall of Blackthorn Pack looked exactly as Elena remembered it, the same towering stone pillars, the same ancient wooden platform where she had once stood to hear her exile pronounced. But this time, as she walked across the familiar stone floor, with Kai and Lyra held securely by each hand, she carried herself with a strength she had not possessed 6 years earlier, forged through years of survival and the fierce, unbreakable love she held for her children. The hall was fuller than it had been on that terrible night of her exile, word having spread quickly through the pack in the days following their arrival about the mysterious circumstances surrounding the king's sudden departure and unexpected return, with a woman and 2 children few had ever previously known existed. Every corner of the enormous chamber overflowed with pack members, eager to witness whatever announcement had prompted such an urgent gathering. Draven stood upon the platform, where he had once coldly pronounced Elena's exile, but his posture now carried none of the rigid, dutiful coldness of that earlier day. Instead, he stood with visible determination, his eyes finding Elena and the children as they approached, offering silent reassurance before he turned to address the assembled crowd. 6 years ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, I stood in this very place and made a decision that I now understand to be the greatest failure of my leadership. I banished my mate, Elena, based on a fertility ruling that healers across 3 packs confirmed as absolute and certain. I chose to trust ancient tradition and political pressure over the woman I loved, and in doing so, I caused irreparable harm to someone who deserved nothing but my protection and loyalty. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, uncertainty and curiosity mixing as pack members tried to anticipate where this unprecedented public confession might lead. That ruling, Draven continued, was wrong, not simply wrong in outcome, but fundamentally, catastrophically wrong in its very premise. Elena was never barren. Within months of her exile, she gave birth to twins, my son and daughter, both of whom carry the ancestral mark of our royal bloodline, undeniable proof that the healer's ritual failed to detect a truth that has now been confirmed beyond any possible doubt. The murmurs grew louder, shock rippling through the assembled crowd, as Draven gestured for Elena and the children to step forward onto the platform beside him. Kai and Lyra, though clearly nervous beneath the weight of hundreds of curious eyes, stood tall, drawing strength from their mother's steady presence and their father's protective proximity. These are my children, Draven declared, his voice ringing with fierce, undeniable conviction. Kai and Lyra, heirs to the Blackthorn throne by blood and by right, and their mother, Elena, was wrongfully exiled from this pack, through an error I allowed to stand unchallenged, an error that cost all of us 6 years we can never reclaim. Margaret, the healer who had originally delivered the fateful ruling all those years ago, stepped forward from the crowd, her weathered face reflecting genuine shock and dawning horror at the implications of Draven's announcement. "My king, if this is true, then the ritual itself must have contained an error we have never before encountered. I performed that test myself, alongside 2 other trusted healers. I do not understand how such a mistake could occur." "Whatever the explanation," Draven said, "and I trust our healers will investigate thoroughly to prevent such an error from ever harming another family in this manner. The outcome is undeniable. Elena's exile was unjust, and I hereby formally overturn that ruling, restoring her full status as my mate and Luna of Blackthorn Pack, and acknowledging Kai and Lyra as legitimate heirs to this throne, protected by every law and tradition that governs our succession." A charged silence settled over the hall as the full weight of this unprecedented declaration sank into the collective consciousness of the assembled pack. Some faces reflected genuine joy, relief at seeing a wrong finally righted, and a clear succession secured after years of anxious uncertainty. Others, particularly among the older council members who had originally pressed for Elena's exile, revealed more complicated expressions, discomfort at having their earlier judgment so publicly and completely overturned. Charles stepped forward then, positioning himself beside his king, with the visible authority of a trusted advisor, lending his full support to this dramatic reversal. "The king's decision carries my complete endorsement," he announced to the assembled crowd. "I witnessed firsthand, during our journey to retrieve Luna Elena and her children, an assault by Ashgrove Alliance operatives seeking to capture or harm these legitimate heirs before their status could be properly acknowledged. This threat demonstrates precisely why Blackthorn cannot afford to leave this succession question unresolved any longer. We require unity, not continued division, over a ruling that has already been proven catastrophically wrong." The mention of an actual attack against the children sent a fresh wave of shock and outrage through the gathered crowd, transforming lingering skepticism into something closer to protective solidarity. Whatever doubts individual council members might have harbored about the political complications of this announcement, the revelation that a rival pack had already moved aggressively against Blackthorn's newly discovered heirs galvanized a shared sense of urgency around the need to present a unified, protective front. One by one, council members who might have otherwise voiced resistance to such a dramatic reversal of established tradition instead began offering their formal acknowledgement of Draven's decision, recognizing that continued internal division in the face of external threats served no one's interests except Blackthorn's ambitious rivals. As the formal proceedings continued, transitioning into the practical details of re-establishing Elena's status and formally introducing the twins to the pack's various leadership structures, Elena found herself watching her children navigate this overwhelming new world with a mixture of anxiety and profound pride. Lyra, true to her naturally curious and open nature, engaged warmly with the pack members who approached to offer their welcome, asking eager questions about Blackthorn traditions and history that delighted many of the older pack members, eager to share their knowledge with an enthusiastic young audience. Kai remained more reserved, as was his nature, but Elena noticed the way pack members who witnessed even brief interactions with him came away visibly impressed by his thoughtful, measured responses and evident maturity beyond his years. Several older warriors, upon learning of his display of courage and strength during the recent attack, approached with obvious respect, treating him not merely as a child prince, but as someone who had already demonstrated qualities essential to future leadership. As the formal proceedings finally drew toward their conclusion, Draven turned to Elena, extending his hand in a gesture that carried far more significance than its simple appearance might suggest, a formal invitation to complete the rebonding ceremony that would fully restore her status as Luna and finalize the reversal of her wrongful exile before the entire assembled pack. Elena looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, memory and emotion warring within her as she considered everything that had led to this moment. 6 years of grief and hiding and hard-won survival, weeks of careful, honest rebuilding since their reunion in that Crossroads Inn, and the terrifying attack that had nearly stolen her children from her entirely before they even reached the safety of Blackthorn's walls. She had promised herself, and her children, that whatever decision she made about her relationship with Draven going forward would happen on her own terms, at her own pace, never rushed by political convenience or emotional pressure. But standing here now, feeling the familiar warmth radiating from the bonding mark that had never fully released her despite 6 years of separation, watching her children begin to find their place within this world that had once cast her aside so cruelly. She recognized something important settling within her own heart. She was ready. Not because circumstances demanded it, not because political necessity required a unified front against external threats, but because she genuinely believed, after everything they had survived together over these past weeks, that Draven had truly changed, had earned back at least the beginning of the trust she had once given him so completely. She took his hand. The bonding mark blazed to life between them, with a warmth and intensity that drew audible gasps from the assembled crowd, the ancient magic recognizing and celebrating a connection that had never truly been severed, despite years of forced separation. Draven pulled Elena close, and for the first time in 6 years, in front of the entire pack that had once witnessed their painful separation, they embraced as reunited mates, the physical and emotional bond between them, restored, in full view of the community that would now honor and protect that connection going forward. Kai and Lyra, watching their parents' reunion with wide, wondering eyes, exchanged a glance that carried the particular understanding twins often share, a silent acknowledgement that whatever uncertain future awaited them within this new world of pack politics and ancient traditions, they would face it together, as a complete family for the first time in their young lives. "This is not the end of our challenges," Draven said quietly to Elena, as their embrace finally eased, his forehead resting gently against hers, in a moment of private tenderness, amid the public celebration surrounding them. "Gareth and the Ashgrove Alliance remain a genuine threat, and there will be political complications ahead, as our council adjusts to this new reality. But we will face all of it together, exactly as we should have from the very beginning." "Together," Elena agreed softly, allowing herself, for the first time in 6 long years, to fully believe in the possibility of a future built on honesty rather than hidden fear, on partnership rather than unilateral decree. As the celebration in the Great Hall continued late into the evening, pack members gradually warming to their new Luna and her remarkable children, with growing enthusiasm and respect, Elena found a quiet moment to step outside onto the fortress's high balcony, looking out over the same forests she had once walked through, alone in grief and desperation. Kai and Lyra joined her there, flanking her on either side as they gazed out at the moonlit landscape that would now be their home, a place that had once represented nothing but pain and rejection, now transformed into the beginning of a new chapter, built on hard-won truth and genuine reconciliation. "Are you happy, Mama?" Lyra asked, leaning her head against Elena's shoulder with the trusting affection that had carried them both through so many difficult years. Elena wrapped an arm around each of her children, pulling them close as she considered the question honestly, weighing 6 years of struggle and survival against the fragile, hopeful promise of the future now unfolding before them. "I am," she said finally, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that the words carried complete sincerity. "We survived the hardest parts already, both of you and I, together. Whatever comes next, I believe we're ready to face it, as a family, exactly the way we were always meant to." Behind them, Draven stepped out onto the balcony as well, completing their small family circle beneath the wide, star-filled sky that stretched endlessly over Blackthorn territory. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, whatever political battles and external threats would need to be confronted in the days and years to come, this moment, standing together after 6 years of unnecessary separation, represented something none of them had truly believed possible during the darkest days of their individual struggles. A family, reunited, a wrong finally righted, and a future, however uncertain, finally facing forward together, instead of scattered and hidden, across a world that had never fully understood the strength, resilience, and unbreakable love that had carried them through every impossible obstacle to reach this moment of hard-won homecoming.